Now, as we approach this evening's dissertation, I hope that none of you is afflicted with a malady known as New England conscience. Now, New England conscience doesn't keep you from doing anything wrong, it just keeps you from enjoying it. If you've brought it with you, I suggest you discard it. And talking about Yankee humor, whenever you bring out New England stories with those who visit us in the summertime, it usually takes the form of directions. That's the most common story. Like, you know the old story, you can't get there from here, that type of thing. Well, there are quite a few of those, and they happen every day to us as we go around our jobs and travel to meet our family around the state. For example, the story of the man on his way to Skowhegan. And there's a road to Skowhegan where there's a fork, and the sign, believe it or not, says Skowhegan, Skowhegan. You can take either road, and it will get you there. Well, he stopped the car and rolled down the window because there was a fellow walking along the side, and he said, "Pardon me, sir, does it make any difference which road I take to Skowhegan?" The fellow said, "Don't make no difference to me." Or one that's happened to I'm sure almost all of us in one form or another. You come into a community you haven't been before, and you don't quite know where to go, and you roll down the window and you say, "Pardon me, fella, can you tell me where the Johnson family lives?" And the man replies, "Sure can, son. You go down the road about 3 miles, and you turn right where the old church used to be." And usually takes you about a mile to figure out what he said. Coming here to the lodge tonight, going through 5 corners down in Gray, reminded me of a story that, in relation to directions, the state trooper told me a few years ago. And he swore it was true, and that it happened right down at 5 corners. One summer, this out-of-state car stopped and rolled down the window and inquired of a young fellow, "How far is it to Lewiston?" And he said, "From where?" It's a logical question, really. And then there's that old classic of the tourist who drives up, rolls down the window, and says, "How far to North Turner?" And the fellow says, "Don't move a goddamn inch." Well, a few years ago, up to a place that's sort of a favorite in my heart, Bald Hill, the Bald Hill Baptist Church, one Sunday, the parson allowed how they were going to take a second collection that day. It seems the deacons had met on Saturday night and decided it was time to spruce up the church. Now, the first thing they were going to do was put in a new chandelier. And the parson would appreciate it much if, when they passed the collection plate a second time, each and every parishioner would put an extra $1 in the plate. Well, when the service was over and the folks were passing through the door, up back, Amos Barlow stopped the parson, and he said, "Parson," he said, "I just wanted to tell you that I didn't put an extra $1 in the plate today." "You didn't, Ambrose?" He said, "No, parson, I didn't, and I had 3 reasons why. First one was I didn't have an extra $1 today. Second one was, if you get that there chandelier, I don't think you got no one in the congregation knows how to play it. And third reason is, if you're going to spruce up the church, it's about time you fix the goddamn lights." Now, just staying for a moment in the religious vein, at Damerscotta, at the old Baptist meeting house in Damerscotta many years ago. As a matter of fact, the meeting house there was built along the lines that you rarely see these days. They had doors, pew doors on the aisle. You know how they used to open up and close in the old-fashioned meeting house churches? Well, this was some time ago, and a revival team came through Damerscotta and appeared at the Baptist meeting house, and 2 young fellows were converted that night, Jeremiah and Joseph, 2 brothers in the town who had been kicking up more dust than they ought to, if the facts were known. Well, sir, a few months later, Jeremiah was conducting an evening service. He was reading from the scriptures as he looked up. In from the back door came his brother Joseph with a friend of theirs, Elisha. Now, Elisha was splay-footed, which means his feet pointed out. And as they walked down the aisle, Elisha's feet, first one side and then the other, would hit those pew doors and slam them shut. Jeremiah paused from the scriptures and looked up, and he said, "Joe, take Lish out and back him in." Up to Tennant's Harbor some time ago, a fellow dropped by, a tourist type, dropped by a local marine supply store, and he asked, "How's business?" And the fellow said, "Well," he said, "on Monday," he said, "sold a whole set of tackle to a fellow up Port Clyde." He said, "Tuesday I didn't sell nothing. Wednesday, fell up Port Clyde, he brung all that tackle back. So I guess you say Tuesday was my best day." There was this farmer in a community I won't name because it might hit home to many of you sitting here this evening. There was this farmer that had a very successful operation, had a very large farm, as a matter of fact. And unfortunately, he died. Well, his only heir was a son who just didn't quite have it upstairs. Never shown any interest in the farm. If he had, there was some doubt whether he'd really know what to do anyway. So he sat around for a few months and did absolutely nothing, which you can't do with a successful farm. Well, finally he decided what he wanted to do was raise pigs. And of course he knew nothing about it, So he went down the road to his neighbor, his nearest neighbor, and inquired just how one went about raising pigs, because he decided that that's what he was going to do with the farm his father had left him. Well, his neighbor allowed how he was a mite fortunate, being a young fellow who didn't know nothing about it, because his father had left him the best sow in the whole county. Now, all he had to do was take that sow down the road about 3 miles to Eustace Littlefield's, who had a hog down there that would service his sow for about $25, and bring the sow home, and before you know it, he'd have some pigs, and he'd be in the pig business just like that. Now, of course, if he was serious and wanted to raise a good litter of pigs, his neighbor allowed how he might go down the road about 5 miles to Porter Fenderson's. Now, Porter had a hog down there that last year at the county fair won 2 blue ribbons. Now, that would cost $50. There was no question with the young fellow's sow and Porter's hog why the litter of pigs he got would be a darn sight better than those of Eustace's. But just to be honest, and to tell the whole story, his neighbor allowed how 10 miles down the road, Harry Sawyer had a hog that for 5 years running won a blue ribbon Skowhegan State Fair. Now, that hog would cost $100 because there was a fella through last week on the same mission. But with that young fella's sow and Harry Sawyer's hog, absolutely no doubt about it, he'd have the finest crop of pigs in the whole county. Well, the young fella thanked him and went home. Next morning, he got up bright and early, picked up the sow, put it in a wheelbarrow, and went down the road 3 miles. He laid out his $25, sat around the kitchen having pie and coffee all day, and that afternoon he hiked the sow back in the wheelbarrow and went home. Next morning, he got up bright and early and went down the pen to see if he had any pigs, right? Nothing. So he hikes the sow back in the wheelbarrow, and he goes down the road 5 miles to Porter Fenderson's. Pays his $50, sits around having pie and coffee all day, puts the sow back in the wheelbarrow and goes home. Next morning, he's up bright and early, down to the pen to see if he has any pigs, right? Nothing. So he hikes the sow back in the wheelbarrow, and he goes down the road 10 miles to Harry Sawyer's. Lays out 10 crisp $10 bills, sits around, has pie and coffee all day, and late that afternoon, puts the sow back in the wheelbarrow and goes home. Well, now, as you can imagine, this was some tuck-it-out young feller after 3 days of hiking that sow around. The next morning, he just couldn't get out of bed. He turned to his wife and he said, "I just can't move a muscle." He said, "Would you go down the pen to see if we have any pigs?" Well, she allowed how she would, and she hopped out of bed and ran down to the pen. She came running right back, and he said, well, have we got any pigs? She said, no, there aren't any pigs, but the sow's waiting for you in the wheelbarrow. A few years ago, upstate, in a little place called Whittapitlock, I see some of you know it well, there was one of those May December marriages. Elias Peabody, who was going on 78, married Phoebe Jackson, who was just 19. Phoebe just graduated from school up that way. She was a sprightly young thing. Elias was a widower, well thought of in the community, had a good, successful farm, and outside of the age differential, the folks thought that was nice that little Phoebe had a nice husband like Elias. Well, they gave him a good send-off in the Grange Hall with the party that Wednesday afternoon. And when it was over, why, Elias sat Phoebe up in the front seat of the truck, of course, and took her home. Well, that night they climbed the stairs to the second story, got into bed. Elias turned to Phoebe and he said, "Now, Phoebe, I'm a man of habit. I has my breakfast at 6:30 every morning. Now, I don't mean 6:25. Lord knows I don't mean 6:45. I mean 6:30. Now, you don't need to fret none about my being underfoot during the day. There's lots of chores here in the farm. But I have my lunch at 12:15. I don't mean 12:05. Lord knows I don't mean 12:20. 12:15. Now, Phoebe, I'm a man that believes in dressing for dinner, and I'll be ready at 5:30. Not 5:15, not 5:35, but 5:30. Now, Phoebe, I'm a man that takes my pleasure on Tuesday and Friday nights. This is Wednesday. Good night, Phoebe." With all the headlines recently about pollution in the United States, air pollution, water pollution, and all, the town fathers up to Bald Hill got quite concerned. As well they might, because one of the local natural attractions was the Squiddery-Gusset River. They got their drinking water from it, and they got a lot of tourist business in the springtime and the fall with fishing and all coming through there. There was good trout stream it was. And they became concerned not what condition the Squiddery-Gusset River was today, but what lay ahead with all the pollution problems that abounded in the country. So they proceeded to hire an engineering firm down to Portland to take a study. Well, a few months went by, and the engineering firm allowed how they were ready with their report. Then there was a special meeting of the Board of Selectmen. Now, the representative from the Portland engineering firm got up, and he said, "Gentlemen, we have come here this evening with not one, but two reports. One optimistic and one pessimistic. At your pleasure, gentlemen, we're prepared to give the two reports." Well, the chairman of the Board of Selectmen, he allowed how he'd like to have that optimistic report first. And the representative from the engineering firm got up and said, "Well, gentlemen, briefly, in summary, the optimistic report is that inside of 20 years, the Squiddery-Gusset River will consist of nothing but raw sewage." The chairman said, "Good God, man, if that's the optimistic report, what is the pessimistic report?" Well, the reply to that, gentlemen, sir, is, in summary, there won't be enough to go around. Up to Brownville Junction a few years ago, outside of Brownville Junction to be accurate, this young couple had been married about 2 years on a farm of their own, and it had not been too successful. They were operating in somewhat of primitive or early day circumstances. They did not have electricity as yet, despite the rural electrification program. The farm had been less than productive. But as things would have it, the young lady did get pregnant. And the day the baby was arriving, the young fellow hopped in the old pickup truck and went hell-bent into Brownville Junction to get the doc. Well, he brought him back in due time. The doc had his little black bag, of course, and they came running into the house, and the doctor took one look at the situation, and he told the young man, "Now you get that water boiling, son. You tear up that sheet over there in strips and hold up the lantern." Well, about 20 minutes later, the doctor turned around and said to the young farmer, "Let me be the first to congratulate you, boy. You're the proud father of a strapping baby son. Hold up the lantern! Hold up the lantern!" 5 minutes later, he turned around and said, "By gracious, young fella, let me be the first to congratulate you that you're the proud father of 2 strapping sons." The young farmer was, of course, quite pleased with that, and the doc said, "Hold up the lantern! Hold up the lantern!" And 5 minutes after that, he turned around and said, "First time in my life, boy, I want to tell you that I got a chance to congratulate the proud father of 3 strapping sons." At that, the young farmer looked at the doc and said, "Doc, you don't suppose it's the light that's drawing them, do you?" I've heard a tale. I really don't know if it's true or not, so it's best we don't identify where it came from, but I've heard it so many times from so many people, I'd like to pass it on to you. They say it happened to a fellow by the name of Philo Parsons. Whether that's true or not, I really don't know. It seems that Philo, who lived outside of town on a farm, went in town for supplies one day. He was a widower, lived alone except for the hired girl he had to take care of the house. Well, he came back from town for supplies, and as he got out of the truck, he heard this terrible caterwauling coming from inside the house. As he ran through the front door to see what it was, all of a sudden it dawned on him. That caterwauling was coming from upstairs, and before he went in town that morning, he'd painted the bathroom John. As he ran up and rapped on the door and said, "What's wrong?" Girl said, "I'm stuck. I can't get off." Well, he said, "Just a minute, I'll help you." And he tried to open the door, but she had it locked. "Unlock the door." She said, "I can't. I'm stuck." Well, he said, "You hold on. I'll get a ladder." So he went out in the barn and got a ladder and put it up to the window and climbed into the bathroom. Of course, she wasn't too pleased about that, you know, and just caterwauled even more. But he said, "Now, I'm going to get behind you and push, and you pull." Well, he did, and she did, but nothing happened. And he said, "Well, I'm going to have to go get a wrench and unhook the seat." So with that, he went down the ladder and out the barn and got a wrench, came back, climbed the ladder through the window, and he unhooked the seat. He got her off that way, but of course he couldn't get the seat off. Well, there was only one thing left to do, and that was take her in town to the community medical center. So he hikes her over his shoulder and takes her downstairs, puts her in the back of the truck, and being a decent gentleman, puts a tarpaulin over her, and drives into the medical center. Well, so they put her up on one of those moving tables, you know, and on her elbows and knees, of course. And they got her into the operating room, and they called the local doc, who was affiliated with the medical center there in that town. And as he walked into the operating room, that typical nurse that you hear so much about and see so much about, you know, those nurses that have seen everything and know everything, came up to the doctor and said, "Doctor, have you ever seen a sight like that before?" The doc said, Yes, nurse, I have, but I must admit, I've never seen it in a frame like that." In a little town I won't mention, where two fellows lived across the road from each other by the name of Charlie and Seth. Now, this was a town that was so Republican that the only Democrat in 20 years had been ridden out of town on the rails. Charlie looked out his window one day and he saw on the corner of Seth's house, "Vote Democratic." Well, that bothered him, but of course it was none of his business, you know. So he didn't say nothing for a couple of days, and finally he looked out and there was another sign that said, "Vote Humphrey Muskie." Well, that he couldn't take. He charged out the front door, went across the dirt road, went up onto Seth's porch, rapped on the door, and when Seth came to the door, he said, "Seth, how long we been neighbors?" Seth said, "Oh, nigh on 40 years, I guess, Charlie." Said, "Seth, how long you been Republican?" He said, "Oh, I'd say about 39 and a half, Charlie." "Well, Seth, I think I'm owed an explanation." He says, "Yes, Charlie, I guess you are. I hadn't wanted to say nothing about it. But the doc allowed how I don't have many months to live. And I decided if anyone had to go, it'd best be one of them." We hear a lot about traveling salesmen. I think the traveling salesman stories originated here in New England. But one that's rather cute is about the traveling salesman going along one of our less traveled roads late at night in a storm. And unfortunately, true as the story is, through no fault of his own, he had an accident. The car went off the road, leaped a ditch, rolled over several times, and the salesman was really quite banged up. He came to with blood coming down his face, a leg he could not walk on. He didn't know where he was. There were no other cars on the road to be seen, and the only sign of life was way up ahead, a light. Well, laboriously, in great pain, the salesman dragged himself towards that light. As he got closer, it turned out to be a farmhouse. He dragged himself up to the front door, and with the only energy left in his body, he rapped his head against the door. Well, the farmer inside opened the door and looked down at this sight before him. Blood, despair. The salesman said, "I need help." The farmer said, "Well, to be honest with you, son, I've got to tell you that I don't have any daughters." The salesman looked up and said, "How far to the next farm?" A friend of mine who moved up here last summer, buying a summer place that they'd been admiring for many years, told me this story about after moving in for several weeks, they decided they would explore some of the countryside they hadn't seen before. And they covered some roads that, quite frankly, they didn't know existed. And as they came around the bend in one road, lo and behold, here was a farm that was something to be seen. A beautiful old farmhouse, freshly painted. The barn was freshly painted. The fields were closely cropped. The fences were in good repair. It was just a delight to see. It impressed them so much that they wanted to compliment whoever it was had the farm. And as they approached the farm, they noticed this man out behind an old-fashioned plow, 2 horses and the old rig you had to hold on to. And so they stopped and got out of the car and climbed over the wall and went into the field to meet the gentleman. They introduced each other, and this couple said, "We just wanted to tell you that this is just a delightful sight. This farm is beautiful, and it's marvelous. Do you handle this farm yourself?" And the man, who, by the way, was 72, said, No, I don't. As a matter of fact, couldn't do it all by myself. I have my father with me." I said, "Have your father with you?" "Oh, yes. Yes, he's been helping me all my life." I said, "Well, how old is he?" "He's 93. "Well, could we see him? We'd like to compliment him, too." I said, "Oh, of course you can. He's down South 40. Said you go down the road there, just about half a mile, turn left, and you'll see him. He's beside another plow just like this one." Well, sure enough, they got in the car and went down, turned left, and there was his father out behind another plow. They got out of the car and went up and introduced themselves again, went through the whole thing and complimented them about the farm and said, "It's amazing that 2 men of your age, alone in the world, could have such a marvelous, well-kept farm." And the old man says, "Oh, we're not alone, you know." I said, "You're not?" I said, "Oh, no. We have my father with us." I said, "Your father? How old is he?" "He's 109. "Is that a fact? Well, that's amazing." "Well, glad you think it is." "Could we meet your father?" I said, "Afraid not. He got married yesterday." Got married? Heaven's sakes, why would a man of 109 want to get married? Didn't want to. Had to. One of those advertising executives from New York City had been coming up to Merry Meeting Bay every fall to do his duck hunting. Now he had the latest outfits, the latest coats, the latest boots, the latest guns, the latest ammunition. He had 2 friends that he hired as guides every year. There's no question about his getting his limit of ducks, but what really challenged him each year as he came up was to do something that would impress these local Maine guides. Nothing he would do would get a comment out of them at all. If he had a new gun, a new type of shot, a new jacket, they were completely nonplussed about it all. So he finally decided that the one thing that these fellows prided more than anything else was a bird dog. And he was going to get the best bird dog that money could buy. He found the best trainer, got a dog from the best litter, sent him to school, and the next year he came back with not only the best gun and the best boots and the best jackets, the best bird dog that money could buy. The first day out in the blind, as a flock came over, that New York advertising executive dropped his first duck. He looked at the dog and said, "Go." And the dog leaped out of the blind and walked right across the top of the water, picked up the duck, walked back across the top of the water, into the blind, and dropped it at his master's feet. Well, that fellow from New York turned around to his 2 friends, who said absolutely nothing. The next duck he dropped, he looked at the dog and said, "Go." Once again, out of the blind, right across the top of the water, picked up the duck, right back across the top of the water, into the blind, dropped it at his master's feet, and hardly had a drop on his paws. He looked around at the men, and they just smoked their pipe and were nonplussed about the whole thing. Well, this went on 5 or 6 times, and finally the man from New York couldn't stand it any longer, and when the dog came back and dropped the duck for the last time, he turned around to one of the men and said, "Don't you notice anything different about that dog?" The guide said, "Sure do, fella. Can't swim, can he?" Then there's that quick one about the fellow who pulled up to the gas station and inquired of the attendant in a rather small town. He said, "Say, what do you do for excitement around here?" The attendant said, "Son, we just don't get that excited." It's nice to see the ladies here this evening, the wives. A friend of mine told me about swapping conversation on health with an old friend of his that he hadn't seen in a long time, and he said, "How's your wife?" And she said, she's an angel." The reply was, "That's fine, mine's still living." There's a man a few years ago lived on an island in the Connecticut River, which, as you know, consists of the boundary between New Hampshire and Vermont. He lived right in an island in the middle, and there had been a dispute for many years as to which side of the river the boundary between the two states actually existed. And one time he went into the general store over there in Offutt, New Hampshire, and he said to the proprietor, "Have you heard the news?" "What news?" "They've decided that the boundary is on the Vermont side of the river." The proprietor of the general store said, "Thank God," he said, "I couldn't stand any more of those Vermont winters." Up to Bucksport a few years ago, there was a fellow by the name of Otis Watkins. Now, Otis was a bridge tender. Lo and behold, the legislature met, passed a new act building a new bridge that was going to put Otis out of work. Well, he went to the county commissioners and allowed how he'd been a good and faithful bridge tender all these 18 years. And he'd appreciate it if they could find a spot for him for 2 years so he could qualify for state retirement. Well, they thought it over and allowed how he had been good and faithful all these 18 years. And it was a shame that he should lose out on all the benefits and all of state retirement, but the only job that was open was county sheriff. Well, they talked some more about it, and out after all, there wasn't much he could do to louse things up Bucksport way in 2 years. He would be on retirement, and they could run somebody new. So they finally decided they would run Otis Watkins for sheriff. Well, one of the commissioners thought perhaps he ought to do some politicking for Otis, because, you see, Otis was in that bridge tender shack for 18 years. He didn't quite know how to go out and shake hands and meet people. So the commissioner was outside of town a ways, talking to a friend of his who had a good-sized farm. And he explained the whole situation about Otis, how he'd been good and faithful for 18 years, needed 2 years for retirement, they were going to run him for county sheriff, etc., etc., and he'd appreciate it if his friend would vote for Otis come town meeting time. The friend said, "I won't." Said, "You won't?" Said, "No, sir." "Will you mind telling me why?" "I don't mind at all. 5 years ago, I had the best damn cow in the whole county. She gave more milk in 1 day than most of these farms give in a whole week. Well, so one day she got constipated. I took her in town at the dock, and he allowed, but all I had to do was get 2 buckets of soapy water to her, and she'd be all right in no time. Also brung her home, and I tethered her right out back, and I got me 2 buckets of soapy water. Now, not having a funnel or nothing, I borrowed my boy's bugle. Well, sir, I no sooner got 1 bucket of soapy water and that bugle to her than one of them damn automobiles backfired. And that cow takes off, stake line and all, hell-bent for Otis's damn bridge. Well, sir, every time she bring her hindquarters down, that bugle give out the biggest blotch you ever heard in your life. That stupid Otis thought it was one of them steamboats. He opened up the bridge, the damn cow fell in. She ain't surfaced yet, and if you think I'm going to vote for a fellow for sheriff that don't know the difference between a steamboat and a cow with a bugle in its eyes, you got another think coming. In closing I'll give you a few minutes to work on that if you In closing our group therapy meeting tonight, I'd like to tell you just a little short story, which, number one, I personally like very much. It sums up my feelings about Maine and New England. Although it may not be as humorous as some that we have heard this evening, it perhaps indicates how a lot of us feel about our state. It's a story about a man named Elmer Peterson, who used to live in Booth Bay Harbor. Now, Elmer died at age 84. And as all good men from Booth Bay Harbor do, he approached the pearly gates. St. Peter stood before him and said, "Name?"
Elmer Peterson. Residence, Booth Bay Harbor, Maine.
Well, Mr. Peterson, how long have you lived there?
84 years and 3 months, till today.
Well, just a minute, Mr. Peterson. I'll look in the big book. St. Peter does, and he returns to the gates and says, "Mr. Peterson, step in. But I don't think you'll like it." Think about it. Thank you very much.